Well, welcome everybody. It's great to have you aboard today. And let's start off by doing the obligatory Happy New Year. And welcome to Global Radio Ideas number 8. My name is Ken Benson. I head the P1 Media Group. My co-host today is Andy Sanneman. He's the CEO of Benstown and is joining us from Germany.
Hey guys, we're so glad that you join us today on our latest webinar, Global Radio Ideas, 5-star show prep, how to create killer content. What a name. The chat box is activated. You can always give us a shout out, tell us where you're watching. Our guest Francis, he's going to take your questions later on at the end of the show, so don't be shy. Just ask away, guys.
So let's begin by giving you a brief overview of the experience Francis brings to the party today. He began his career, like many of us did, as a presenter, but at many stations in the UK. He then moved on to become a program controller before launching London's Magic 105.4. He then went on to program one of the most admired radio brands in the world, London's Heart. And then after Heart, he said, I'm going to consult some stations. He's done that throughout Europe and some other areas of the world as well. And in 2017, Rupert Murdoch's company, the Wireless Group, hired Francis to be the group content director for their stations in the UK and Ireland. And during his tenure, he relaunched the iconic Virgin Radio brand on DAB and hired away the iconic and legendary Chris Evans from BBC. Today, he's back to consulting, and he recently launched a new show prep service. So please welcome our guest, Francis Currie.
Hi, how are you doing?
Hey, Francis. So we usually start this session with you telling us something we don't know about you. I think I know what you're going to tell us, but I think the rest is going to be pretty impressed. At least I was when you told me a couple of years ago. So,
well, I don't know. I mean, I'm entirely blaming you for this, Andy. This was not my idea, but we were talking, I think, a couple of years ago, probably at Radio Days Europe. I think it probably was, and it came up that that I was in the gym. And I don't even remember how this conversation got there, but yes, I was a very late starter in terms of going to the gym. I started going regularly when I was 49 years old, but I take it reasonably seriously, and at this point I can deadlift 165 kilos, which is 364 pounds.
Whoa,
and there's a picture of me looking particularly relaxed.
The world's most powerful consultant.
And the reason I particularly like that photo, I don't have a lot of photos of me doing this stuff, but if you look carefully, the bar is actually just starting to bend, which makes me smile.
Yeah, that's something I would not attempt, but it looks great. So let's get down to business. We're talking about killer show prep today. And Francis, I recall when I was a baby DJ, program directors would say, hey, you got to do show prep. And, I never really knew what to do. They said, do it, but didn't tell me how to do it or where I should do it or where I should look. So I think I did what most people did. And back in the day, kind of picked up the newspaper and thumbed through and maybe found just 2 or 3 things I thought I could maybe include in my show. But, how does a DJ even go about preparing for their show properly?
It's really funny. A few years ago, I remember sitting in the studio with a national radio presenter. She sat down in her chair, started the first record, turned to me and said, I have nothing to say to these people. And you kind of go, what level of arrogance is it that makes you think you can walk into a radio studio without a moment's thought about what you're going to say or what you're going to do? So for me, I mean, we'll get into the detail in terms of the prep, but for me, there are 5 stages that you need to think about before, or at least 3 of those 5 before you even get in the studio. Number 1 is choosing the content. And that's, that research stage, deciding what you're going to talk about, is the first stage. I think, like you, Ken, when I started, I thought that was prep, just kind of reading the newspaper, then walking in. But actually, once you've decided on the content that's appropriate for the radio station and appropriate for the audience and that fits you, then you need to think about, what's my position? What's my view? Because if I'm going to be a valuable presenter, I need to add value to the things I talk about, not just repeat something I've read. So what's my position? And then you need to think as a presenter about, what am I going to do with this? How am I going to deliver this? Am I just going to read it out of the paper? Am I going to tell it like a story, or am I going to do something more creative with it? And I think those 3 bits of prep need to take place before you walk in the studio, before your head's full of back timing and things going wrong and news people coming in, or even if you're working from home, the dog coming in or the kids coming in when you're trying to record a show. So that the second half, those last 2 bits when you walk in the studio, your brain is fully engaged with thinking about how am I going to deliver this content? And also, very importantly, how am I going to promote it and cross-promote it? Because I think we all know most people miss most of what we do on the radio most of the time. So actually, very often, the promotion of the content is as important as the content itself. So those 5 stages, content, position, treatment, performance, promotion, are all things you should consider as part of your preparation. A couple of other things just to say on that. This will vary a bit by radio station, but basically TSLs in most markets are getting shorter. People are listening to the radio less. And of course, almost no listener, tunes in at the start of your show and tunes out at the end. I hate to break it to you, but real life quite often gets in the way of sitting down and staring raptured at the radio while the radio presenter casts his magic spell. So if the average duration of somebody listening to the radio is, say, 20 minutes, then in those 20 minutes, you need to make sure that you deliver kind of the range of content that you want people to understand that you represent. And I'll talk about this more in a minute, but in my view, there are sort of 3 kinds of prep. There's credibility content, there's context content, and there's key content. And we'll talk about those a little bit later on. But also in terms of prep, I would always say bullet point, don't script. You can just tell when the script gets in the way. I would have bullet points to keep the presenter on track, but read it and it suddenly becomes a different thing. And I would normally say you want to bullet point the intro, the outro, and up to 3 key points in the middle. One more thing to say in terms of that, sit down at the start of the show and listen all the way to the end, and the way that doesn't happen. Let's assume, and this would be not a bad thing in today's radio world, that somebody listens to an hour a day to a radio station, not just an hour a day to your show, but an hour a day to a radio station. So an average of 7 hours a week. Well, the reality is that somebody who has that behavior misses 96% of all of the output. And that's why the cross promotion is so important. And that's why if somebody does catch your show for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, half an hour, maybe longer, then you need to make sure that you're actually delivering something to the listener that adds value to their lives. And I also think what that means is you don't necessarily need to develop whatever the number is, 4 pieces of original content for each of your 4, 5, 6 hours on air, because you should be thinking about generating the best content and then making sure as many listeners as possible hear that content. So thinking about recycling, reversioning, repeating, making sure that you deliver the good stuff often enough that a typical listener gets a chance to hear it and enjoy it.
Yeah, I think the number is impressive. 69% of miss definitely get to the reality of like good content. So I assume proper show prep, according to I think the standards you described, is a lot of work. So can you allude a little bit more on the obvious, but maybe also not so obvious benefits of those?
Well, I think you need to consider, who's important in this relationship. And in this case, there are 3 in the bed. First of all, there's the radio station you're on, the radio station brand. And what's important to your program director, to your general manager, to the station owner? Well, there's probably just 2 or 3 things. First one, making money. It's a business, and that's why it's there, unless you're a public service broadcaster. A priority for a business at the moment, most businesses, is just survival. Staying in business during the pandemic, where we've seen in many markets listening go up, and we've seen revenues collapse. And of course, the owner also wants to see the value of that radio station increase. So from the radio station's point of view, they want to make money, stay in business, and increase value. From the presenter's point of view, I think most jocks want to be more than just a voice on a stick. They want to have longevity in the game. They want to connect with their audience. but perhaps more than anything, they want to build their brand. And there's a DJ, a jock, a morning show announcer in the US who died a few years ago, who said one of the best things I ever came across. He's not necessarily very well known in Europe, but was a big name, and interestingly, is still a big name in the US, I think 7 years after he died, and that's Kid Craddock. And he said this. He said, what does the presenter need to do? And I think this is such a great quote. One thing per quarter hour that commands attention. One thing per hour that causes a response. One thing per day that is shareable. One thing per quarter that listeners remember. And one thing per year that makes you legendary. And I think from a presenter's point of view, that's unlikely to happen if you just walk in the studio and think of the first thing in your head. Delivering to that kind of a standard to make sure the audience really values what you bring to their lives takes prep, takes work. But what it does, it increases the value of the presenter to the radio station and to the listener and helps make them more famous.
I think the thing Kid did that made him legendary, and I may be wrong, but my experience with that show and with Kid working with him years ago, is every year they would take a plane full of terminally ill children and their families to Disney World. And for many, many, many years, and all their fundraising and charitable efforts through the year raised money to make this happen. And it was truly extraordinary.
I mean, he was an extraordinary guy, right? I mean, he was a legend and still is, like Francis said, super successful on the air in the United States.
And he's not somebody I ever met, but I look at that and I just think, that's a remarkable ambition. And I think that's a man I want to hear, or would have wanted to hear, just because of the focus he brings to his work. So we've got three people in this bed, right? So we've got the radio station, the brand you're working on. We've got the broadcaster, the radio presenter, and what they need to do. And perhaps most importantly, the most important person in the radio station is the listener. And we need to make sure that whatever we deliver to them connects with their head, their heart, or their hand. In other words, is it interesting, entertaining, or useful? Because if they can't think about it, care about it, or do something about it, then it's not actually going to be engaging for them. And if part of our job as broadcasters is to make more listeners listen longer, then we need to do something for those listeners that actually adds value to their lives. So for me, every piece of content before it goes to the air has to pass that test. Will the typical listener, will the target listener of the radio station I'm on find this interesting, entertaining, or useful? And if the answer is no, then throw it away and use another piece of content you prepared, or play another record because I want to hear that more.
Right. So that's the filter that you recommend to the presenters before they even consider putting it on the air.
Absolutely.
Does it meet one, two, or all three of those pieces in the filter? So yes. The thing I want to talk about, and the thing we promised today, was how to make killer content, right? So if we use that filter, assume we have a piece of content that hits two or three of those. How do you know, or how do you take that and now all of a sudden make it that super engaging piece of content that's going to connect with the audience?
Okay, so let's talk about the three different kinds of content. And not every announcer can play equally with all three of these. I mean, I think one of the interesting things about the rise of streaming services, and the 1524s especially, sort of deconstructing radio so that they're rolling their own. They're going to streaming services for the music and then podcasts for the audio content. So I think what we're seeing in radio is that the guy who just does what we used to call a time and temperature jock doesn't bring much value anymore because they don't add much. So I think one of the things we're seeing is that a lot of program directors are giving broadcasters, announcers, a bit more room to be creative and a bit more room to play. And it's interesting to discover those who can adjust and can do that and those who can't. But I think every time you open the microphone, it's a creative opportunity. So let's talk first about key content. These are the bits where you might spend a bit more time brainstorming if you're doing a morning show and increasingly a drive show or a late show. You might maybe have up to a couple of minutes to play with here. And you're thinking about what can we do that's really going to pass the Kid Craddock test of the one thing per day that is shareable. And suppose you take a piece of content. I don't know. Let's take a survey from online, something as banal as that, and it's about, oh, I don't know, putting on weight during lockdown or something like that. Then what are you going to do with that piece of content? Maybe your first choice is, I'll read it out of the newspaper, I'll read it off the website. Fine. You've done a service there, you've saved somebody the bother of reading it for themselves. But if you've got the opportunity to be creative, then what else could you do with it? Well, you could tell a story that could be from your own experience, or from a listener experience, or from a colleague's experience. You could create a team talk if you've got 2 or 3 people in the studio, or a producer in the studio. You could maybe have a guest expert. You could open the phone lines, have a caller. If you've got time, you could write a parody song. You could develop a quiz. You could do your own survey online to complement the one you're talking about. You could maybe do a top 10 list where you're thinking about the top 10 things that have gone wrong since we were in lockdown. You could do a social media poll. You could do a comedy sketch. You could do some kind of a stunt around it. Maybe you go out on the streets and do a vox pop. You could do a music feature built around it. Maybe you send out a reporter and do something on location. The starting point is the idea, is the thing about putting on weight in lockdown. And typically what happens is the first few ideas that come out when you start brainstorming, you start thinking about this, is the same stuff you've done before. You have your ready go-tos. Well, we did that last time, let's do it again. And typically what happens, if you take a little bit longer, take a couple more minutes, if there's a group of you, sit through the silence for 30 seconds or 40 seconds. If you're leading that group, you say, come on, what else, to keep pushing people. Then the really good stuff comes. Then the gold comes. Then you really start to get new, fresh, original, different, interesting ideas. And it's then that people start talking about the show and start wanting to hear you, because they don't know what's going to come next. So that's in terms of the key content, they are the slightly bigger set pieces that take a bit more prep. But they also are the things that make you legendary. Now, if you're a middays jock, if you're on sort of during the day or early evening, you may not necessarily have the chance to do as many of those, although increasingly there is the opportunity, but not necessarily the broadcasters with the skill to do it. There are 2 other kinds of content. There's credibility content, where this is about giving the listener confidence that the announcer knows what he's talking about and cares what he's talking about or she's talking about. And this is particularly if you're on a local station. You really need to make sure you know how to say the local street names, that you sound like you're connected to the patch. If you're on a station that's a bit more plugged into music, maybe its calling card is the music, then the listener needs to believe that you know and care about the music. We all know the social influencers, their business is based on the power of recommendation. And announcers have that same power to turn a song from another play of the same song into something that really connects in a new and meaningful way. So the credibility content, whether it's music or sport or showbiz or localness, is really important and can be prepared in advance and should be part of the preparation mix to make sure it's not forgotten. The third type is context content, and especially for people who are increasingly voice tracking for different markets that they don't necessarily know so well. They really need to spend some time thinking about making sure they sound connected to the place and the time they're broadcasting to. And I think for voice trackers, it's hard because you're normally working a day ahead, and sometimes for places you've never even been to. But I think for the audience, they need to feel that there's a sense of here and now from the announcer about the show that's going out. And of course, there are lots of things you can use to do that: news, weather, travel, showbiz, local events, social media, all of those things.
Yeah, so that's how to create killer content. So my interest obviously is like, as most of, I think the stations are represented here, and we all work as like music leaning or music heavy stations, meaning stations that rely on musical content big time. So Let's talk more about the musical content. I think that's a really interesting area. So how important is the right music info for the music, let's call it music listeners, or for people who listen to the stations who play mostly music? And what is the right amount? And let's not use the word hour, let's use the word sweep, because it might be different on every station. We had the TSL thing before. So, and how should that be planned out during the sweep? Like, how often do you repeat that? How often do you talk about a new song, another one? How do you recycle content for the same song? Because I feel that's kind of challenging. Like the same info a couple times might be boring. So that would be a topic I'd be really interested in. I think a lot of our now viewers and listeners would be as well.
You know, if you take out the commercial content, probably on a typical music station, then about 70 to 80%, sometimes higher, of the content is music content. And if people are choosing to listen to that radio station, it's because they know and like the music. God knows there are enough choices in the world now in terms of new channels appearing every day, both broadcast and streaming. So the listener, you know, your starting point is the listener cares about the music. So the presenter really, again, needs to find a way of adding value to that music without necessarily being a complete nerd, but making sure that they sound connected to the music, they sound passionate about the music, and they sound knowledgeable about the music. That in terms of the music, they've got something that's interesting, entertaining, or useful to say. Now, useful used to be often to do with concerts and gigs, and at the moment we're a bit stuck on that. But for example, if they've got a new album out, or new merchandise, or they've got a new thing on the website, the presenter should know about that. And it's actually even more important on older services, because the risk is they sound old-fashioned, and that stuff can make them sound very connected to today. So I think that music content is so important, and the presenter that kind of ignores the music honestly sounds a bit fake. It sounds like they're separate from the music that surrounds them. So I think it's also important in terms of embedding them in the content of the show.
So Francis, we're going to get to some questions and answers from our viewers in just a couple of minutes, but I want to do one more question for you, because obviously I know you're a big believer in music content and sharing that kind of information with the audience. So tell us about this new prep service that you started that does just that. Okay,
well, it's called Smash Prep, and there are lots of prep services for morning show people where people will trawl news services and find interesting original content. The problem that Smash Prep is designed to solve is the announcer, sometimes voice tracker, sometimes live, who is having to play a lot of music and know and care about the music, sometimes voice tracking several shows in a day, and sometimes having to find new things to say about songs that have been around for 25 or 30 years. And I watch people in the studio kind of going to Facebook, going to Twitter, going to Instagram, going to Songfacts, going everywhere to try and find something new to say. And there's a fantastic jock in the UK called Bam Bam, and he came up with this first and came up with the idea of a dashboard where we basically bring all of those things together so that on one single page, we've got well over 1,000 artists now in Smash Prep. On a single page, you can instantly look at somebody's Facebook, Twitter, latest news stories, song facts, artist website, tour info, as and when that comes back, Wikipedia, so that you've got new information. And the news feed is real time, so all the time you've got new stuff coming in. And then, for example, I looked at David Bowie today. Now, it was the anniversary of his death a couple of years ago, but even today there were sort of, I think, 9 or 10 new news stories about people doing things with the David Bowie legacy, or talking about artwork, or being mentioned by celebrities. And that just makes the job of being an announcer, being a music presenter, so much easier. That hurdle of what have I got to say about this when I'm playing it, you know, sometimes jocks will play songs 3 times in a show. So this is a godsend for always having something new and interesting to say about any artist or band. And the other thing we do is like if we don't have your artist to fit your format in the 1,000+ already, all you've got to do is tell us, and within a few days we'll have that artist added as well, and then they're there forever with their data being constantly updated. It's at smashprep.com.
It's a powerful tool. I saw it, and I think it's no excuses anymore. Like if Francis can deadlift 165 kilograms at the age of 49 plus, I think this is a perfect tool to create killer content, or with the help of that to create killer content for your show, right? So it's a powerful service, Francis, and thank you so much for alluding more on this, and I can highly recommend everyone to check it out.
By the way, if you do go to smashprep.com, obviously it's a subscription service, but not expensive. But if you on the front there are 3 buttons which allow you to just click on and just go through and have a look at what that dashboard looks like, and you can look at the real-time information coming in, so you see exactly what an artist page looks like.
Great.
Obviously,
we do have a few minutes for some questions. So
Absolutely.
if you guys have questions for Francis, just type them in the chat box and we'll get to them. First one comes up from David Woolrich. How important is it to continue creativity off air, such as on personal social media, as surely that's a continuation of a station brand via the presenter?
100%. If you want to build a brand now, it's got to be more than just on air. You know, I think people are always on, and there is an expectation from the audience that, you know, you are where they are. And I think making sure that it doesn't become a sort of a complete nightmare every day, but making sure that your social media feeds are up to date, interesting, entertaining, and useful, I think is part of the job now. For those people who don't know, was on BBC Radio 2, national service in the UK. His show had 9.5 million listeners a week, so it was the biggest radio show in Europe. I hired him to come and do the Virgin Breakfast Show, which when he joined had 330,000 listeners a week. But Chris, you know, he's got a very creative brain. He's got he's a very naked broadcaster in that, you know, he puts his life on the air, and he's very real, and he has relentless enthusiasm. I mean, he's a master craftsman. He's one of those people, also creative and fun and enthusiastic, something like that.
Okay, so I'll take the next one from my friend Sakis here. He writes, given that people through social media are more egocentric with their opinion, would it be wise to ask their input even for music content? Like, what is your favorite story about band, song, gig, whatever? So basically turning it around. So I think that's an interesting one as well. So giving the people who are like vocal on giving basically the, how you call that, the credibility issue a little bit away, like the credibility away to your listeners, and kind of let them lead the show, if I understand that correctly. I think that's what the question implies.
You know, I think this is a complicated area because you want to engage with the listeners. Equally, the person who calls or texts the radio station or connects with you on social media is not representative of the silent majority. And we know that for definite because the silent majority are not connecting with you, which means this person is not representative because they're doing a behavior that most people aren't doing. So I think it's really good to have the conversation, and it's really interesting to talk to those people, but it's very dangerous if you allow them to drive the show or to drive the agenda.
Okay, a couple more things here I want to share. First off, a nice comment from Joel Rabb. This was excellent. We'll check out the service.
Thanks, Joel.
And getting back to the music, this comes from Philippe Plentix. I probably butchered the last name, and I apologize. But don't you think that the emotional connection with the music is more important to build your speech around than just trivial facts?
100%, without question. Emotion beats logic every single time. And I think, you know, when I would, for example, talk about telling a story, well, that story could be about when the band got together in 1973 and the drummer's best friend used to go out with the lead singer's friend. It could be that, or it could be about when you took someone to a concert and the way they sang that song. And when you looked around the auditorium and you saw 5,000 phones, all held up, all swaying in time. It was really moving. So 100%, you know, emotion beats logic all the time, in nearly everything, always.
Especially in entertainment.
Yes, yeah. Make them laugh, make them cry,
yeah.
make them care. You know,
make them feel.
Yes, interesting. Interesting is good. Emotional is better.
Well, Francis, thank you so much. It's been great having you as a guest today. We appreciate it so much.
Thank you
and
so much.
And this is how you
can
contact Francis. You're so welcome. And to our viewers, thanks for joining us. If you missed part of today's session or want to share the video with some of your coworkers, friends, colleagues, it should be posted later today on the P1 Media Group and Benstown websites and social channels, as well as I'm sure Francis will have it up at his places that he surfs. So feel free to look for that. Now, listen, next month, we're going to be speaking with another British programmer. However, today, this guy lives in Canada, and he's a programming executive for Rogers Radio. And he's also an expert in talent development. So join us on Thursday, February 18th. The session's called, as you can see, Benchmarks Are Out, Conversations Are In. That's going to be interesting because I know everywhere I go, people talk about benchmarks, especially when it comes to breakfast and morning shows. So I definitely want to learn more about that. So anyway, thanks, you guys. Thanks for joining us again. Smashprep.com. You can learn more about Francis's new service. And on behalf of the P1 Media Group in Benstown, thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you on the 18th of February.
Thank you so much, guys. Thanks, Francis, for making the time. We do really appreciate it. I think it was very informative.
Great to talk to you. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers. Bye.